On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I'm Anya Manuel, your moderator for tonight, and it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest. Husain Haqqani is the former ambassador from Pakistan, first to Sri Lanka and most recently to the United States. He was a trusted advisor to the late Pakistani Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. And Ambassador Haqqani is now a professor at Boston University and the director for South and Central Asia at the Hudson Institute, as well as the co-editor of the journal Current Trends in Islamist Ideology. He has written for every major publication in the world, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Financial Times, and others. Ladies and gentlemen, here to discuss the US-Pakistan relationship, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Haqqani.
Thank you very much, Anya, for that kind and brief introduction, or briefly kind introduction, or kindly brief introduction. It's a pleasure coming back to the World Affairs Council here in Northern California. It's, of course, always a little trek coming from the East Coast, especially if you only come for a day. But I always feel very refreshed by the opportunity of being able to talk to people who usually are very well informed about the rest of the world. San Francisco is such a unique place. It's such a diverse place. Most people who probably come to a talk about Pakistan know Pakistan through the perspective of Pakistanis that they know. And Pakistanis, as a people, are a very warm, loving, energetic people. I know that because I'm one myself. But the US-Pakistan relationship, given its many ups and downs over the last 60 years, and then the state of play inside Pakistan, which almost always has a negative dimension, at least in the media, makes people wonder what's wrong with this place or what's wrong with this relationship. Having served as ambassador from Pakistan to the United States for 3.5 years, from 2008 to 2011, I tried very hard to try and bridge this gap in effect. And having failed in that miserably, I have now decided that I am going to talk about it and write about it and try and explain what exactly makes these two countries allies and yet unable to trust one another. And for that, we have to go right to the beginning. Most Pakistanis themselves are unaware of some of the historic realities that I have uncovered or mentioned in my new book, Magnificent Delusions. And the reason for that is simple. Pakistan is a young country. It was created in 1947. It cannot trace a history beyond 1947. As an idea, maybe another 7 years. 1940 is the year that the demand for Pakistan was articulated by the All India Muslim League, which asked for the Muslim majority areas of India to be seceded from India and to be made into a new state called Pakistan. So what was done after the creation of Pakistan was to actually try and explain to the people of Pakistan why Pakistan existed, and to pretend to the rest of the world as if Pakistan had a history that everybody had to accept, instead of recognizing Pakistan's youth. Pakistan's leaders decided to present themselves in a very contrived manner as something they weren't. Then there were other problems. When Pakistan was created, Pakistan got 1/3 of the army of British India. This army had been created by the British, recruited by the British and trained by the British, primarily to be their foot soldiers in the Second World War. It wasn't created as a national army. Yet, when the partition took place, the Muslim units of the British Indian Army became the Pakistan Army. And 1/3 of the British Indian Army came to Pakistan, even though only 17% of the revenues of British India came to Pakistan. So Pakistan, on day one, faced the question that faces many countries: how do we allocate resources? The resources are only 17% of what was a bigger entity, and we have this huge military. Now, one option would have been to say, well, we don't need such a huge military. We are going to actually send some of these soldiers back into the farms. But that wasn't done. Pakistan felt very insecure about India because India had been reluctant to accept, or India's leaders had been reluctant to accept the creation of Pakistan. And there had been an ideological and political polarization in the subcontinent between the All India Congress led by Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru and the Muslim League led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. That choice of keeping the huge army led Pakistan to a succession of what I would term as mistakes, which have brought us to where we are today. One of them was the assumption that Pakistan, because of its strategic location at the crossroads of South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East, could actually leverage its location and basically try to become an actor or a player in the Cold War. The Cold War was just beginning when Pakistan was created in 1947. India's Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru decided that India will be non-aligned in this Cold War. And his argument was very simple. He said, A, India doesn't have a problem with the Soviet Union. It doesn't have a common border with them. It doesn't have a dispute with them. And it is too poor and too weak to actually start becoming an actor in great power games. That annoyed some leaders in the United States. In fact, when you read my book, which I hope you will find that several American leaders, especially those of the conservative persuasion, were particularly annoyed by India's decision not to get entangled in a global confrontation against communism. And India didn't even ban the Communist Party. By 1957, one of the Indian states actually had a elected communist government, the first anywhere in the world. On the other side, Pakistan actually wooed the United States and came to the US and said, the Soviet Union wants us to be their partners, which was not factually true. There's no evidence whatsoever, and now the Kremlin archives are open for inquiry and research. The Soviet Union had not even recognized Pakistan, did not have diplomatic relations with it until 1949. But the Pakistanis were already trying to market themselves to the Americans, saying, you have to provide us arms and you have to provide us economic assistance because we are a frontline state. That decision resulted eventually in Americans taking an interest in Pakistan. Initially, they did not. In 1949, the Indian Prime Minister came to the United States, and when he was asked by President Truman in a very typically American way, by the way, I mean, I've found that Americans always, when they meet somebody from another country or culture and hear about their problems, etc., their first response is, what can we do? What can we do for you? You know, which leads me occasionally to tell my students when I teach them international relations in Boston, I always tell them, if there's one thing you can do for America and for the rest of the world, it is to realize that the world is not a problem for America to solve. It's a situation for Americans to understand. But anyway, so the American response was new countries, new independent countries, first major decolonization after the Second World War. What can we do for you? And Nehru replied, I want you to invest in education in my country. I want you to help me provide an educational institution similar to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Hence, the Indian Institute of Technology was born with great input from the United States. I want you to help my country's agriculture. I want you to come and teach us some of your methods which have enabled you to have much higher yields per acre. They have revolutionized and enhanced productivity. And the Americans, of course, provided that. When Pakistan's Prime Minister came to Washington, D.C., he was asked the same question, what can we do for you? And his response was, we need X number of airplanes for our Air Force, X number of ships for our Navy, X number of tanks for our Army. My joke on all of that is, with hindsight, that eventually both sides got what they wanted or what they asked for. Pakistan got the tanks, Pakistan got the planes, Pakistan got the naval ships, hand-me-downs from the US Navy, all used ships, but they were handed over to Pakistan at that time. And India ended up getting the IITs, it ended up getting the agricultural extension programs and healthcare programs that were shifted from here. Now, the result of it, 66 years forward, in 1947, the literacy rate of what is today Pakistan was 16%. The literacy rate of what is today India was 18%. It was a 2% difference. Today, India's literacy rate is 75% and Pakistan's is 55%. The 2% has become a 20% gap. But if you do it on a gender basis, 62% of young girls between the age of 5 and 15 in Pakistan do not see the inside of any classroom of any sort. Not a religious school, not a madrasa, not a regular school. What did Pakistan end up doing? Well, Pakistan eventually became an American ally by the 1950s, especially after the election of the Eisenhower administration. And there's a very interesting episode in the book about how that happened. John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, was somebody who believed in this notion of a huge Manichaean conflict between good and evil, between communism and Western values. And so he was very annoyed with India for not joining his crusade. He liked the idea that Pakistan's leaders wanted to join that crusade. And so he signed Pakistan up as an ally for what was known as the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO. When he came back after signing that treaty, Walter Lippmann confronted him at a party and said, look here, Foster, you've signed Pakistan up for SEATO, but Pakistan is not in Southeast Asia. So what are they doing in SEATO? And Dulles turned around and said, well, you know, the British have told me that the best fighters in Asia are the Gurkhas. So I have signed on the Pakistanis as allies. Lippmann turned around and said, but Foster, the Gurkhas are not Pakistanis. John Foster Dulles turns around and says, really? But they are Muslims, right? And Lippmann says, no, they're not Muslims either. They are Hindus. Dulles at this point says, oh, well, okay. But without any sort of reconsideration of his analysis, he still says it's better to have an ally than not to have one. And so therefore, we'll embrace Pakistan. But by 1957, after America had armed and equipped and paid the salaries of 5.5 divisions for Pakistan's military, Pakistan had not yet expressed willingness to provide a single soldier for any of the anti-communist projects that Dulles was presiding over. So not a single soldier for Korea, a refusal to provide any soldier for Indochina. Deep down, Pakistanis wanted to be non-aligned too. And the Pakistani leadership set a precedent that has continued ever since, comes down even to this day and age, which is to lie to the Pakistani people. Although they were negotiating with the Americans, all these treaties, etc., they were telling the Pakistani people, we are not doing this. And finally, when the American pressure became too much, that, we give you so much, you have to give us something. You don't give us soldiers to fight the communists. You're not giving us military bases. Pakistan provided a base to the CIA to listen in the Soviet Union. And the very first U-2 flight from that base got shot down in the Soviet Union, as luck would have it. Francis Gary Powers' flight. So this relationship was all about arms and money. And why did Pakistan need that? Pakistan by 1958 had fallen under direct military rule, but it was under military influence beginning with 1951. In the minds of many Pakistanis, the US-Pakistan alliance is primarily an alliance between Pakistan's military and the US military. Pakistanis would argue, or the Pakistani military and its sympathizers in Pakistan would argue, Pakistan needed it to confront India. But the fact was that Pakistan was repeatedly telling the Americans that all it wanted to do was to have a defensive military capability against communism, which was not a threat to Pakistan at that time. In 1965, eventually, with better arms from America, Pakistan went to war with India. And that resulted in Americans cutting off aid to Pakistan for the first time. Now, Pakistanis took that as an insult and, of course, a stab in the back. But the truth is that the agreements that their leaders had signed with America explicitly said that if Pakistan initiates war with India, Americans will cut off the supply. So again, not informing the Pakistani public ended up creating anti-Americanism in Pakistan. And my conclusion is that Pakistan's successive leaders, especially the military ones, have always cultivated anti-Americanism as a means of negotiating with the Americans in a better way. Basically, it's like saying, my people hate your country, I love it. So you need to give me aid and support and money to be able to hold on to this country, because if I am not in charge, this country will fall into the hands of those who hate the United States and can become a source of trouble. To fast forward, Pakistan again offered itself as a staging ground for war against the Soviets when the Soviets finally moved into Afghanistan as a result of a series of Soviet blunders. At that point, Pakistan was already running a campaign inside Afghanistan, which had again to do with Pakistan's, what President George W. Bush finally wrote in his memoirs, Pakistan's obsession with India. Pakistan wanted to prevent Afghanistan from asserting any claims on Pashtun territories of Pakistan, which the Afghans argued had been taken away from them illegitimately by the British. The Durand Line, that is the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, was drawn in 1893 by a British officer. So the Afghan argument was, we signed a treaty with the British have left, now we should have the right to reclaim our ethnic kin, the Pashtuns. And that became a source of problem. But Afghanistan was too weak to do anything about Pakistan. Pakistan had a very huge army. Pakistan could not fight militarily. But in the minds of the Pakistani military, the potential for Afghanistan and India joining up and creating a pincer, both sides, East India, Northwest Afghanistan, both kind of squeezing Pakistan, that was what Pakistan was trying to avoid. In between, Pakistan had lost its eastern wing, and that is a whole chapter in this book that you may find interesting. There's another new book on that whole episode by Gary Bass called The Blood Telegram, which is about the East Pakistan genocide in 1971, when Pakistan, when in a first free and fair election in Pakistan, the people of what was then East Pakistan voted for leaders whom the West Pakistanis did not consider acceptable. And so the Pakistani army, which was primarily from West Pakistan, went in, fought its own people in a huge civil war in which India eventually got involved, and Bangladesh was created. So after the creation of Bangladesh, instead of Pakistan re-evaluating and saying, well, our borders have shrunk, our population has been reduced to less than half of what it used to be, maybe it's time to revise our policies and not be so militaristic and not want to have such a huge armed force, and maybe cut a deal with India and have good relations in our neighborhood. Pakistan again insisted on American aid to build its military. And there was a civilian government for 5 years led by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, which there are documents that are reproduced in my book, which kept on offering military bases, etc., things that had not been offered in the past, because the Pakistani military was putting it under pressure and saying you have to get this from the Americans. So it was all, again, about rebuilding the military capability. And Pakistan wanted to secure Afghanistan for itself. Now, everybody in America thinks that Pakistan helped, and many Pakistanis have become convinced of that also because of what they've been told. Pakistanis became convinced that Pakistan became the staging ground for Charlie Wilson's war. I hope everybody is familiar with either the book or the movie. I knew Charlie Wilson, by the way. I had the occasion of meeting him. He wasn't as handsome as Tom Hanks. I can assure you of that. And nor was he as charming. He raised a lot of money basically appropriated a lot of congressional money, and there was an agreement between America and Saudi Arabia that every penny that the Saudis give will be matched by the Americans, and every penny the Americans give for the Mujahideen will be matched by the Saudis. That really ballooned into a multi-billion-dollar operation against the Soviets. But the Americans had only one purpose. That purpose was to bleed the Soviets, to make Afghanistan a Soviet Vietnam. So when the Soviets sued for peace and said, we'll withdraw, the Americans said, fine. And so the Soviet withdrawal occurred, and America also withdrew from the region. Many Pakistanis say, and I used to say that too as a younger man, that the Americans deceived Pakistan because they created this jihad and then they left Pakistan in the lurch? Not true. Truth is, the American purpose was very specific, and that purpose had been fulfilled. And America at that time told Pakistan to back off from the jihad, which Pakistan was not willing to do because Pakistan was not fighting Charlie Wilson's war. Pakistan was fighting Ziaul Haq's war. Ziaul Haq was the military dictator who was Islamizing Pakistan and who wanted Pakistan to become more of an Islamic state, and he wanted to use jihad as an instrument of Pakistani influence to gain leverage in Pakistan's dispute with Kashmir, or with India over Kashmir. And so he was training jihadis that would then transform into fighting India after the Afghan problem had been solved. And he still wanted a government that Pakistan controlled to be installed in Afghanistan. So then the second rupture between Pakistan and the US occurred. In between, Pakistan became a nuclear power. Even though Pakistan had continually told Americans that if you give us conventional weapons, we will not acquire nuclear weapons. But that promise was not fulfilled. So where are we today? Because of time, I'm going to just condense. Hopefully, I've whetted your appetite sufficiently to want to read the story of this sort of star-crossed romance between two countries that can't live without each other and can't live with one another. Pakistan has become a dysfunctional state as a result of its militarist, militant-obsessed policies. The jihadis have now started turning inwards. They kill more Pakistanis than they kill Americans or Indians or Afghans. Pakistan's own national discourse has become so polluted that the vice chancellor of the Punjab University, who is a physics PhD, by the way, he has written a book saying 9/11 was an inside job. It was orchestrated with the specific purpose of giving America an excuse to go and attack Muslim countries. But more importantly, he says that the US and the UK are run by a cabal of bankers, which of course is a euphemism for Jews, a cabal of bankers that controls the world by implanting microchips in the heads of people they use to exercise that influence. Of course, after reading this very illuminating book, I have been working with all possible experts, including medical doctors, to at least get the chip that is implanted in my head out. But since there's a chip implanted in their head too, they lie to me and they say there is no chip in your head or mine. My point being that you would expect that the vice chancellor of the country's largest university, the highest academic in the country, would talk sense. But he has chosen to advance conspiracy theories. If you watch Pakistani television news or Pakistani television shows, the entire country lives on conspiracy theories, totally on conspiracy theories. And towards the end of my tenure as ambassador, I myself ran up against a conspiracy theory. Now, and as you all know, as ambassador in Washington, D.C., I could pick up the phone and call any official. But the conspiracy theory was that there was about to be a coup. And this guy, Husain Haqqani, asked the Americans to send their military to stop the Pakistani military from taking over power in a coup d'etat. Of course, if I had done something like that, I would be a hero in my own eyes, because preventing a coup d'etat is a good thing. Keeping the constitutional government going is always a good thing. But that wasn't so. I didn't need to ask some businessman sitting in Monaco to send a message for me to the US military. But the public opinion in Pakistan now is so poisoned that this became an issue. Where are we now? So Pakistan has all these internal problems. Economically, it's not doing well. Education-wise, we are behind. Conspiracy theory obsessed, military dominated and militant dominated, but a wonderful people. What is the future of the US-Pakistan relationship? That is what this book is about. My argument is that Americans have deluded themselves into thinking that just by providing military aid, they are helping stabilize Pakistan. I think that it's not a good idea to be the funder and the supporter of both sides in any military conflict. Pakistan, on the other hand, has the delusion that by standing on America's shoulders, it can somehow become larger and bigger and more powerful and more important than it is. Having nuclear weapons should not be the only source of pride for Pakistan. If Pakistan has nuclear weapons, it can also be a source of reassurance. Nobody can attack us. But Pakistan is behaving like the guy who buys guns to protect his family and children and then stays up all night out of fear that somebody will come and steal the guns. That, in my opinion, is not security consciousness. That is paranoia. And that delusion needs to be changed. I have some specific suggestions about US-Pakistan relations, but I'm going to stop here right now because I think Anya is going to have many questions for me, and I also want to leave time for questions from all of you. I don't see my book just as being about US-Pakistan relations, even though it is. I think it is a template for understanding how the United States conducts foreign relations totally based on errors of judgment and on assumptions about others that are not borne out by facts. A failure to understand other cultures and other realities. And in case of Pakistan, not understanding that you are actually creating problems for your own ally. So Pakistan and the United States need to think of a post-alliance future. That is the bottom line. Lots of interesting anecdotes in the book, and I hope that you will enjoy the book, even if I bored you with my talk right now. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ambassador Haqqani. That was one of the best short summaries I've ever heard of US-Pakistani relations and where things are. So it's very impressive. You have sparked a lot of questions. And I want to start with the theme of anti-Americanism, which you touch on very heavily on the book, and you're actually quite critical of your own press. So in some recent American polls, 84% of Pakistanis view the U.S. not favorably. Is this a result of U.S. policy, including the drone strikes, which have been very contentious in Pakistan? Is it the result of a cynical manipulation of Pakistani public opinion by the military and the media and others for their own purposes, or is it a bit of both? And how would you unravel this?
Well, there's a case to be made about U.S. foreign policy always. I mean, there's always room for criticism of U.S. foreign policy, and many Americans criticize American foreign policy too. But in case of Pakistan, one of the findings in the course of my research, because I really researched very hard, when was the first anti-American demonstration? Guess what? It wasn't after the first drone strike. It was in May 1948, when America had done nothing to Pakistan, nothing with Pakistan, nothing about Pakistan, and yet there was an anti-American demonstration. So that made me inquire deeper into the question and see the pattern. And it's very interesting that, for example, the American embassy in Islamabad was burned down in 1979. Again, before the war against the Soviets, before a period of tremendous engagement, the close ties with Ziaul Haq. Why did it happen? Based on a rumor at that time, by the way. The rumor was that the Grand Mosque, the Muslim holiest shrine in Saudi Arabia, had been captured by some people. They were actually Muslim radicals. But the rumor in Pakistan was the Americans did it. And so they went and burned down the embassy. I was a student at that time and a student leader. So at Karachi University, when people said, let's go and burn down the consulate in Karachi, which also had a huge library that was open to the public, I stood up on a bus and gave a speech. And I said, look, here's how I see the problem. If tomorrow we find out that the Americans didn't do it, we won't be able to come back and unburn the building. So why don't we do it the other way? We go home today, and if tomorrow it's confirmed that the Americans did it, we can come and burn the building tomorrow. And that kind of rational reasoning appealed to the people, appealed to the crowd, which dispersed. Now, from that point, which was in 79, and I was just a very young student at college at that time, I've always had this thought. If I was able to persuade the people with a very reasonable argument, hey guys, don't burn anything on the basis of a rumor, wait. You can burn. If they have done this horrible crime, they should pay for it. But if they haven't, they shouldn't. It appealed to the reasoning in Pakistan. Why is it that on all occasions, when anti-Americanism is really revved up in Pakistan, the reasonable voice doesn't come out? After bin Laden, nobody turned around and said, hey, this guy was an enemy of Pakistan too. So the Americans should have told us, rap them on the knuckles for that. But it's not such a big deal. He needed to be taken out. Somebody had to do it. And we need to find out why the heck was he living in our country. That's a bigger issue. Who was supporting him? Who kept him there? Who paid for him? Etc. But instead, again, the anti-American wave swept. How dare they come into our country without our permission? Same goes for the drone strikes. Hakimullah Masood, who's recently been killed. I mean, his group is involved in the murder of Benazir Bhutto. They were responsible for shooting Malala Yousafzai. They've been responsible for shutting down girls' schools in the northwest of Pakistan. They've claimed responsibility for terrorist attacks throughout Pakistan, including those on the army headquarters of Pakistan. And yet, it's anti-Americanism that is being fed rather than anti-extremism. So my view is that it is by and large the cynical manipulation. That is not to say American foreign policy is without blame, and it hasn't given opportunities for that cynical manipulation. But the fact of the matter is that the history of US-Pakistan relations and anti-Americanism in Pakistan shows that the anti-Americanism does not have a causal link with events in American foreign policy that impact on Pakistan. Lastly, here's the bad news for those of us who really care about Pakistan. While anti-Americanism in Pakistan has been there for years, now there is a new anti-Pakistanism in America that is totally unprecedented. For the last 3 years, since the bin Laden event, when Americans are asked in opinion polls to express whether they have a favorable or an unfavorable view of certain countries, 3 countries consistently come with the least favorable view: Iran, North Korea, and Pakistan. For Pakistan to be separated from North Korea just by 1% and having only 15% approval in the United States with 79% disapproval, it does not augur well.
Thank you. I agree with you wholeheartedly, and it does make it difficult for those in the U.S. government who are friends of Pakistan. One of the great examples of this is many of us pushed really hard for a civilian aid package for Pakistan, which finally was pushed through with the Lugar-Berman Kerry bill. And there were demonstrations in the streets of Pakistan against this aid package.
It's very interesting that package was basically the government of Pakistan welcomed it. And ironically, recently when Prime Minister Sharif came, the joint communique actually said, even though Mr. Sharif at that time had threatened demonstrations against the Kerry-Lugar-Berman bill, but as Prime Minister, the joint statement with the US government actually said that Pakistan is thankful for the Kerry-Lugar-Berman bill. So when it comes to taking the money, there is no reluctance. But the point at that time was basically an orchestrated campaign by the Pakistani military, which felt that some of the conditions in that bill related to civilian control of the military. And one thing that I haven't been able to touch upon today is that in Pakistan's history, the military has become an independent actor. Now, I respect the military. Everybody should respect the military of their country. But I do not respect the right of the Pakistani military to countermand the thinking of the elected civilians. The Constitution of Pakistan makes the President of Pakistan the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. And the officers of the Pakistan military do not have the right to hold every civilian in contempt. In any case, armies are raised to fight enemies. Parliaments and political leaders are the ones who determine who is or is not the enemy of a country. And so if the army says, no, India is going to be an existential enemy and an eternal enemy of Pakistan, although there is no eternal enemy in the lives of nations, and therefore we will not let the civilians cut a deal with India at any price or at any cost under any circumstances, that really messes up Pakistan. And so conditions about the military, civilian control of the military were the ones that prompted that reaction at that time. Again, manipulation and orchestration rather than a natural reaction of the people of Pakistan.
Thank you. That's a perfect segue. We have lots of questions here, so I'll combine them a little bit. But one that came up over and over again is the U.S. has tried a number of things in its policies towards Pakistan. We've given substantial amounts of aid, most of them on the military side. We've essentially tried to bribe Pakistan into assisting us in Afghanistan and in the border areas. That policy has been only moderately successful. But we have had a democratic handover of power in Pakistan. Where does that leave us now? What should U.S. policy be towards Pakistan now?
First of all, the United States must understand that no country in the world will change policies that its leaders consider to be in its national interest. So what we really need in Pakistan is a genuine debate about what is Pakistan's national interest. I want to be able to go back to Pakistan and make the argument that it's Pakistan's national interest to accept whoever is the government in Afghanistan and become friends with it instead of trying to install a government that is favorably disposed to Pakistan or is controlled or manipulated by Pakistan's intelligence service and trying to install it in Kabul. That it's in Pakistan's interest to move on in its relations with India. And even many nations have disputes. Look, China thinks Taiwan should be part of China. But China is not constantly sending insurgents into Taiwan to try and take it over because they understand that you can't live with eternal war. So Pakistan can have a similar attitude towards Kashmir as well, that it can say, you know what, Kashmir really should be with us, but we're not doing anything about it right now because we have to get on with our lives. We can't hold our nation hostage to just one issue. So Pakistan needs policy change. And it's not going to change until Pakistani public opinion, elite opinion, and the military leadership opinion about what is Pakistan's national interest changes. So American policy should be geared towards enabling that recognition in Pakistan. Bribing doesn't work. $40 billion in aid since 1947 hasn't worked. Now, just by way of comparison, the total American aid to South Korea since that period is $15 billion. Look at how South Korea has transformed those $15 billion into an economic miracle, whereas Pakistan is still struggling. So Pakistan's elite and leaders will change only when the futility of the policies that they have consistently pursued is demonstrated to them. What US aid has conversely done is that it has made Pakistan's elites think that they can have their cake and eat it too, that they can continue to be a militarist state, but the elite can live well. The military officers, the civil servants, the feudal landowners, the industrialists, they live reasonably well because they live off either US assistance or European assistance or IMF or World Bank assistance that keeps flowing into the country. If the Pakistanis realize that no, we need to be part of the rest of the world, where Malala Yousafzai is a greater hero than Abdul Qadir Khan, the nuclear scientist who sold Pakistan's nuclear secrets to Iran and North Korea, then Pakistan will also slowly change its view. Otherwise, Pakistanis will continue to live in a world that is totally our own, where we can think that people do things because they have microchips implanted in their heads.
Okay. Apropos conspiracy theories, the next question is about relations between the U.S. government and the ISI. What are they? How close are they? How effective are they?
Well, the CIA and the ISI have a long-standing relationship going back, of course, to that U-2 base. And that was the reason why that was done. Then in the war against the Soviets, people forget. No American crossed the Durand Line into Afghanistan because America didn't want to provoke the Soviet Union. So and the entire operation, the Mujahideen operation, was conducted by the ISI with American money and American arms that were bought on the international market so that they couldn't be said to be American arms. And that's all the CIA did in that whole operation. Subsequently, after 9/11, and you are familiar with this part because you were in the government as well, the US effort has been to try and see if ISI will cooperate in counter-terrorist operations and counter-terrorist intelligence sharing. And the ISI has selectively shared intelligence. Their problem is they think there are certain jihadi groups that are their allies in the regional power game. for Afghanistan, for India, etc. So Hafiz Saeed of Lashkar-e-Taiba, because his primary focus of operations is against India, even though he threatens America and Israel too. But you know what? We'll accept him because he's our ally. And so is the Haqqani network, which has nothing to do with me, by the way, even though actually their family stole my family name. But that's a personal quarrel we can talk about later. And the Afghan Taliban, some of them, they consider them as allies. But in case of Al-Qaeda, they were willing to share intelligence. But the consequence of that kind of overly nuanced, if you want to put it politely and nicely, overly nuanced policy is that if you are allowing, if you are allowing Group A to operate, but you want to crack down on Group B, what is preventing Group A from having some of Group B's members protected along with its own members? And one of the theories about Osama bin Laden is that Osama bin Laden did not have the official protection of Pakistan's government or military or intelligence service. He had the protection of other jihadi groups, some of whom have the protection of the state. So the ISI-CIA relationship still is one in which, somebody in the Central Intelligence Agency once said, the business we are in requires us to deal with criminals. And I think that applies to the ISI too. So the ISI tries to deceive the CIA tries to deceive the ISI, but both also ostensibly cooperate. This intelligence cooperation will probably continue, but I see that, again, as having diminishing returns, especially after the bin Laden raid and several other developments since then, because Americans can't 100% trust Pakistani intelligence. Pakistan can't 100% trust American intelligence, especially after it was revealed that Raymond Davis and characters like him were actually spying on Pakistan. So it creates a unique situation where the two intelligence services are not enemies, but they are not friends. And of course, several people have used the term frenemy, but there are those who say the problem with having a frenemy is that the FR can sometimes get lost in conversation.
That's good. And as a follow-up from that, how serious, from your perspective, is the Al-Qaeda threat that remains in the region as versus the threat from the Afghan and Pakistani Taliban? What are the different groups and the different threats you see?
Look, some of us make a living, as academics, parsing these details of these movements, etc. But the fact of the matter is that there is no Afghan Taliban faction or Pakistan Taliban faction that actually opposes Al-Qaeda publicly or directly. And many of them have overlaps with one another. So, for example, North Waziristan, which is a stronghold of the Haqqani network, is also the stronghold of Chechens and Uzbeks affiliated with Al-Qaeda. And ironically, Hakimullah Mahsoud, who is from South Waziristan, the leader of the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, was killed while visiting North Waziristan. What does that tell you? That it is not as compartmentalized as some people think. There is a problem. Americans always think of Al-Qaeda as some kind of a linear organization. It must be like, I've read articles by some people comparing it to a corporate hierarchy or something. Well, corporate hierarchy is true, especially in the Bay Area. Everybody knows people have actually tried to invent new models of corporate hierarchies too. So Al-Qaeda is not like that. Al-Qaeda is more like a franchise with many loose connections in some cases, strong in others. It's more of an idea and a belief system. And I think that the Pakistani Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, and Al-Qaeda share a belief system, and so does Lashkar-e-Taiba with them. And therefore, I personally don't see an end to the jihadi threat in the region. And in fact, after American troops leave Afghanistan, my fear is that the jihadi narrative is going to be, we fought the Soviets and we drove them out. We fought the Americans and we've driven them out. Next, we will establish our great caliphate in the near future, beginning from here. And that's the way they see the world.
That's right. Which is actually a perfect transition into the next question, which is, one, is Pakistan interested in seeing U.S. forces remain in Afghanistan for the long term? And then are you interested in seeing U.S. forces there?
The Pakistani military and intelligence services have said both things at different times. They've said, we'd like the Americans to be there to stabilize the situation. And then there are other times when they say, well, you know what? The Taliban only gained steam from being able to say we are fighting foreign occupiers. So if the foreign occupation ends, then the Taliban movement will disappear, which is, of course, a totally wrong interpretation of the ideology of the Taliban and their Al-Qaeda mentors. As far as my personal view is concerned, I think that till such time, look, an army cannot be raised within a 5, 7, 8-year period. Because for a second lieutenant to be trained enough to be able to be a general, you can promote a person in 5 years. But usually from recruitment as a second lieutenant to becoming a general takes many, many years. And so if the Afghan army is going to really become fully effective, it will need several years of mentoring. The Pakistan army came out of the British Indian Army. The first, up until pretty recently, the generation of several generations of Pakistani generals were people who had been trained by the British. And they kept sort of taking over from one another. General Ziaul Haq did not join the Pakistani army. He joined the British Indian Army. As did everybody else who preceded him in that job. So the Afghan National Army will need some mentoring, some technical training, etc., for which I think a significant American presence will still be needed. And also for the Air Force and for modern technology being fully absorbed by a nation that has come a long way, by the way, in the last 10, 12 years, but that still remains one of the more poor nations of the world and a resource deficit nation. I mean, Afghanistan now, a lot of minerals, etc., have been identified as being under Afghanistan soil, but it'll take years before that they are taken out and before that money can be Afghanistan's money. Right now, Afghanistan is a nation that is living on subsidies of others, and after the Americans withdraw, there could be a situation where the Taliban, with support from the Pakistani side of the border, could actually wreak havoc in Afghanistan.
Thank you. Let me just press you a little bit on what I think was a very good answer. And I think you gave us mostly your viewpoint and perhaps the civilian government. But if you ask the Pakistani army, would they want the U.S. to continue its mission in Afghanistan?
Well, ideally what they would want is for the United States to continue their mission, but only on condition that they let Pakistan have its way as well, which is, of course, the way they've always wanted it. I mean, I used the term to have the cake and eat it too before. I'm going to repeat it. That's been their pattern. They don't always have a very realistic view of how the world works. And since that is not going to happen, I think that the general thinking in the Pakistani military is that once the Americans leave, it will give them a relatively freer hand to be able to push for their proteges, groups that they have cultivated, to take over Afghanistan. And unfortunately for the Pakistani military, they have limited their options in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is demographically a diverse country now. I mean, the Pashtuns were never an absolute majority in Afghanistan. They're a plurality. So 48, 49% are Pashtuns. Then there are other groups, Tajiks, Hazaras, Uzbeks, even Turkomans, and a small number of Baluch. And in that ethnic mosaic, unfortunately, the only group that Pakistan has had outreach to are the Pashtuns, who overlap with Pakistan. Because remember, I told you that Pakistan's reason for interest in Afghanistan was to try and reverse Pashtun nationalism. Instead of Afghanistan claiming Pashtun territories on Pakistan's side, Pakistan wanted the Pashtuns in Pakistan to ideologically try and subsume Afghanistan. So it became a Pashtun little effort. And then among the Pashtuns also, only the most conservative religious fundamentalists are Pakistan's allies. So that is a subset of a subset. And that really reduces Pakistan's political options in Afghanistan, which is why I have always, even while serving as ambassador, I criticized the Pakistani military's worldview and always said the easier way to have a friendly regime in Afghanistan is to befriend the regime in Afghanistan. But that's not what they're going to do. I think that the Pakistani military wants the Americans to leave, and once the Americans have left, to start supporting the Taliban once again so that they can at least take over all the eastern and southern provinces of Afghanistan that border Pakistan.
Thank you. Now, there are several questions about Pakistan's internal situation, which, as you said in your remarks, is dire. There's a lack of electricity, lack of infrastructure, lack of education. How do you think the Nawaz Sharif government is doing so far? I have to add a little anecdote. I was actually last in Pakistan in May for the election, and I was, during the election itself, very hopeful because Pakistanis were turning out in droves. The election went by and large peacefully. People clearly wanted a government that's going to govern them and provide basic needs for them. Do you think the Sharif's government's going to be able to do that?
I have no crystal ball to be able to say what they will or will not do, but I can just tell you based on experience and the past. I think that there are two or three problems for the Sharif government that they need to be mindful of. First, their mandate. They essentially captured the imagination of the Punjabi ethnic group in Pakistan, and that's been their mainstay in getting the votes that they did get. They got a large number of Punjabi votes, but that means that the Sindhis in Pakistan, the Muhajirs in Pakistan, the Baluch and the Pashtun are not necessarily very happy with them. So they have to reach out to these other ethnic groups, because Pakistan, whatever people might say, as a kid I also used to say, we should never talk about ethnicity because that's what I was told. We are one nation. But the truth is, sometimes you have to come to terms with the realities that are there. And the reality is that different ethnic groups in Pakistan identify with different political movements and parties. Second, Mr. Sharif himself has a minor problem or major problem. And that problem I will illustrate with an anecdote. The last time he was in office in 1996, although he has matured considerably since then and has gained in experience, but at that time, on one single day, he addressed two meetings. One of the Chamber of Commerce, where he said his vision for Pakistan was to transform Pakistan into a South Asian South Korea, meaning a capitalist modern economy that is exporting a lot and generating a lot of wealth. And in the second speech that he made to religious clerics, he said his vision for Pakistan was based on the moral and ethical principles of the Taliban, which led me at that time to make a comment to annoy Mr. Sharif considerably by saying that. I said, I fail to understand how someone wants to have the ethical and moral compass of the Taliban and the modern capitalist economy of South Korea both at the same time and thinks he thinks straight. I mean, that's like wanting two totally contradictory things. South Korea manufactures televisions. Taliban basically ban and destroy television sets. So it's a contradiction. So my fear about Mr. Sharif is similarly on India. On the one hand, he wants normalization of relations with India. On the other, he always presses the pedal a little bit more on the Kashmir dispute, knowing fully well that Kashmir is at the moment an unresolvable dispute with India. So the way forward is to set aside Kashmir and find the common ground rather than bash your head against the wall of Kashmir and therefore have no normalization of relations. So if he can avoid this sort of carrying two contradictory ideas in the head at the same time, which is usually the sign of an unusual genius, if he can be a bit more normal rather than genius, then maybe he can succeed. And lastly, his relationship with the military. On all past occasions, he's had problems with the military. I've had problems with the military too, so I'm the last one to be able to speak about it, but then I'm sitting outside the country and not running the government. But he will have problems because he has dealt with 4 different army chiefs in office, and he had a problem with each one of them because he always wanted to point out that I'm in charge, which he is and he should be. But how he plays it and can he actually come out on top, which I wish him well, by the way. I really want him to really make sure that the military listens to him. But he needs to be able to say things which the military listens to that also translate into effective and successful policy. Not the confused policy of we are talking to the Taliban one day and we are telling the Americans that you and us together are going to eliminate the Taliban. This confusion is not necessarily going to help Pakistan overcome its problems. And lastly, whether it's Mr. Sharif or his successors, somebody in Pakistan has to have the moral courage to tell the Pakistanis, folks, take a deep breath and try and see yourself from the eyes of the rest of the world. I, as a kid, remember, as a very young man at age 18, traveling to England without a visa on a Pakistani passport. Now, there's hardly any country in the world where Pakistanis can go without a passport. And it's time to tell the Pakistani people that there is a reason why the world looks upon us this way, and we are going to change it. You can't change things of which you have no awareness. If you just create a rah nationalism in which you tell we are perfect, the whole world is at fault, everything is either America's fault or Israel's fault or India's fault or Afghanistan's fault or in some cases Iran's fault, then you are not going to make Pakistanis change, and that will not result in change that will make Pakistan an effective, modern, successful nation that fulfills the aspirations of its people.
Well said. We have time for probably one more extended question, and I had several questions here on education and women's education. So since the very public attack on Malala Yousafzai, has there been a change in attitude in Pakistan towards girls' education?
Look, those who already want girls' education are on Malala's side. But there's a whole set of others who are presenting conspiracy theories. Malala's been called a CIA agent, poor 16-year-old. I mean, CIA wouldn't recruit 16-year-olds.
Recruit them young.
She's been called a Jewish agent. She's been called an Indian agent. There is just a culture. It's a cultural problem that basically, sometimes at the risk of annoying fellow Pakistanis, I say that Pakistanis sometimes, we as a nation have created this culture of just denigrating anybody we disagree with. Why can't somebody be a good guy that we just disagree with instead of being either a traitor or a crook or a kafir, unbeliever? I think that goes back to the way Pakistan was created. Pakistan was created by telling everyone among the Muslims of South Asia that Islam is in danger. If the British leave and the Hindus take over, then Islam is going to be in danger. Since Pakistan's been created, we've persuaded ourselves that Pakistan is in danger. The reason why we have so many conspiracy theories is because we really believe that we have no failings. Basically, we are victims of conspiracies. And unfortunately, that is not an attitude that will help us recognize. If you ask an average Pakistani, he'll say, my sister's educated, my mother's educated. He won't look at the statistics. He won't understand that 62% of girls between the age of 5 and 15 don't go to school in Pakistan. School enrollment in Pakistan is 58% for both boys and girls together, which is far less than India, which has 92% school enrollment now of the 5 to 15 age group, 94% in Bangladesh, 96% in Sri Lanka. People don't realize it. I've come to Berkeley and met Pakistani students there, and they don't know that they are part of a very small minority. There are fewer Pakistani students in American universities today than there are students from Nepal, whose size is 1/5 of Pakistan in population terms. But people don't want to see statistics. They only want to feel good. And when you just do feel good discourse, then you don't change.
Thank you. Now, we haven't this is a big topic and we have very little time, but several questions on Pakistan's relations with India. Is there hope that they will now improve?
There are two parts I would divide that into. Do I want them to improve? Absolutely. Do I see that as the key to Pakistan's future? Definitely. Look, Pakistan's militarism, Pakistan's militancy, Pakistan's lack of investment in education and healthcare, it can all be linked to one thing: Pakistan's desire for military parity with India. Having nuclear weapons should have made Pakistan feel secure. Nobody can attack it anymore. But if you're going to say, no, we're going to go head to head weapon to weapon. Everything has to be exactly what they have. Well, their economy is much larger, their population is much larger, their history over the last 66 years is very different from Pakistan. Their ability to become assimilated in foreign cultures is far greater, or has become far greater. So because of all of that, this competition has to come to an end for Pakistan's sake. Now, so that's my answer of what I would like to see. Is there hope? Unfortunately, so far, even though Pakistan's media has become very diverse and open and everything, I don't see anybody trying to change it. Half the time, television, on Pakistani television channels, people are railing against India and its conspiracies against Pakistan. That doesn't mean there aren't Indians who don't like Pakistan. Of course, there are many. Are there Indians who think that many Indians, in fact, an overwhelming majority of Indians, think that Pakistan should not have been created? That said, do they want to undo Pakistan? I don't think so. I think Indians now want to get on with higher economic growth rates. They want to compete with China, not with Pakistan. And so they basically want to just let Pakistan be. They'd be quite content with it and move forward. And so it's up to Pakistan to try and stop this psychological battering of its own people and making them think that, you know what, we need to compete with India perennially. And I don't see movement in that direction just yet. I don't. And that is one of the reasons why often some people misunderstand me and think that I am not optimistic about Pakistan. I'm just critical because reform does not come until you are critical about what exists.
Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. That concludes our program for this evening. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I ask you to join me in thanking Ambassador Husain Haqqani. Thank you.